Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading with Tatiana. Today I'm reviewing Kindred by Octavia Butler, and I gave this book a 4 out of 5. My Booktuber Shoutout today goes out to Helen Blunden. I came across the channel when I did a review on Claire and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro a few weeks back. And usually when I post my reviews, I like to look at other reviews on Booktube to see what other people thought of this book, kind of like a virtual book club. And I really enjoyed her review of the book, and I went into a deep dive of her channel. Similar to me, her channel does a lot of the full book reviews for each book she's read. So give her a peek on her channel. I'll link down below to see if she's done any reviews of books that you read, and maybe you can start a little bit of discussion. And as always, if you're watching this video, I'll always appreciate if you watch my content to please hit the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and if you have read this book Kindred, I'd love to hear what you thought of the book down below. This book was published in 1979, so it is a bit of an older book, and the genre it's classified as is science fiction. However, after reading it, I think it's more of historical fiction, maybe a bit of like horror. I kind of saw it online as well, and maybe a bit of like realism. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but kind of like historical, realistic portrayal of what happened. A bit about the author, Octavia Butler. So she is actually considered the first Black American female author in science fiction. She was born and raised in California. And I think it's pretty neat because she grew up in a racially integrated community. She had a lot of exposure to a diverse cultural and ethnic community growing up. But even though she was kind of born in a era of racial segregation, and because she saw that like diversity in her community, she saw a lot of power dynamics, especially with different races and I guess people of economic backgrounds living in close communities. So I thought that was pretty neat. She got to experience that firsthand in her life growing up. She was really shy as a child, and she read fantasy and also wrote I guess to get her introverted self out there. And she started her career getting her short stories published, and eventually became a I guess long form or writing novels, which I thought was really similar to the protagonist in this book, Dana, because she also wrote short stories, and I think eventually, if I remember correctly, also longer format writing. I do want to say that unfortunately Octavia Butler is no longer with us. She passed away in 2006, and at quite an early age of 58. She seems to have passed away from a stroke or a head trauma from falling injury. It's not really clear how she died, but it was quite young. So now let's get into the story and the premise and the characters of the book. So this was a in real life book club for me, where someone recommended in their group, and so I went in totally blind, not really knowing what this book was about, aside from that it's science fiction and it's written by a Black American female author. So I went in not even reading a synopsis, and so basically this story starts with Dana. She's 26 and she's married to her husband Kevin. She is Black, Dana, and her husband is white, and they're both like writers. And one day they're at home, and Dana starting feeling dizzy and that kind of stuff. And the next thing she knows, she's in like a forest, and there's a crying baby in the river. She goes down to save the baby, and next thing she knows, a white man, is having a shotgun at her face. And then next thing she knows, she's back in her current state with her husband Kevin in 1976, and she disappeared. And it felt like only a few minutes, but then in 1976 with her husband, she had disappeared for a few seconds. So it sounds super abnormal, and that's the first slice of the science fiction, and that there's like obviously some type of time traveling, because we found out later when she goes back to where she was transported to, it was actually the early 1800s antebellum South, I believe Maryland in the US, and basically it is a plantation, and where she's transported to, it's a plantation owned by a white man who owns slaves, and it's just a very interesting, I guess, then like plot of her being transported to this time and place. She doesn't really know why, and it's never really explained in the book why she's transported back to this place, but there's a pattern of she's transported back to the 1800s to this plantation every time that the slave master's son Rufus seems to be in trouble. And every time he's in trouble, he subconsciously calls for her to come back. And the connection between Rufus and Dana is Dana knows that in her family history at some point there was a white male who married or had a baby with a black woman. And I think in her mind it always was like, oh, like they broke that racial segregation, maybe it was love or whatever. But when she comes back to the 1800s, she comes to realize Rufus was her great 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 grandfather, and she also meets her great great grandmother Alice, who's also on his plantation. And it turns out that maybe what she knew of her family isn't so true. And yeah, it's just a very graphic book. I think it's a really important but heavy read. So I think if you're someone that's sensitive towards reading about slavery and the cruelty, know that going in. However, I don't think you should ignore this book, because just because something makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean that you should just totally avoid. I obviously, as a Canadian, have had some exposure to slavery, but I never really learned it in school in great detail. I'm not sure if Americans do. Please let me know in the comments down below. I'm really curious. But this is the first type of me reading about slavery, which is very graphic, because I've always only read it in a historical or factual sense. So that's basically the premise of the book. Dana is sent back. She's come to realize it's her ancestors. There must be a reason she's there. She's not really sure why, and she also has to act as a slave, which is really crazy, because she, in her current reality, is in the 1970s, where that doesn't exist anymore. So it's quite interesting premise for the book. As I said, this book is talking about the slave period in 1800s antebellum South. So there are so many themes and topics, and man, this is, again, I said, my in real life book club book pick of the month, and there were so many discussions, and this book definitely makes you think a lot about things that happened back then and things that still bleed into society today. So for me, the themes that stuck out with me is that people are a product of their environments. For me to read this book in 2023, it's so clear what's right or wrong. But back then, it's how people were conditioned to act, and yes, it wasn't right, and you would think that if I was back there back in that day, obviously I would stand for myself. I would fight for my rights. I would also maybe, as a white person, not do this to another human being. But back then, people truly believe that black people weren't equals and weren't humans, and it's just crazy to read a book like this, because the 1800s were really just 250 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. So it's crazy to read this book and see how far we've come, and also think about how in 200 years, long after I'm dead, how people look back in 2200, if humans are still alive, back in 2023, and be like, whoa, those things were so backwards. So it's interesting to think about, and also to challenge yourself in what you do in your day-to-day, and what are some things that you do are maybe ignorant or bigoted just because you don't know any better. And it's never too late to change yourself. So I really like that common theme that happened throughout the book. Other one is, and this I can resonate with as a Chinese person born in Canada. In this book, they kind of touch on the idea of Dana, because she's transferred from the 1970s back to 1800s. She is more well-educated. She can read, she can write, she speaks better than the black people back in the 1800s. And so this continuous topic of visibly being black, but then inside you're not black enough, or you're not white enough to be accepted by whites. It's just a very interesting topic and theme, because again, for me personally, I was born in Canada. However, when I talk to relatives back home and my family's home country, I am very Canadian. But I think when I talk to true Canadian people, I have very Chinese cultural tendencies in my life as well. So it is very interesting being born in a country like Canada, where it's very multicultural, and just having this, are you to this or to that, but also why does it matter? But also it really does matter in your interactions. Another common theme is, back in the 1800s, it's very clear that the white people who are slave masters obviously have all the power. But as you read this book, you come to realize that the white people in the household also maybe act out and act violent because they have no power. And it's interesting to think about how people try to exert more power because they have no power, but sometimes by doing that they hurt others. And it's just very interesting because obviously nowadays, obviously slavery still exists in the world, but you could say that more or less slavery is abolished in North America, but there's still a imbalance of power in every aspect of our society and even the aspects of our lives. And it's just very interesting to think about in this book. And the last common theme that kind of stuck with me, because this is a sci-fi book and Dana experiences traveling back in time, just the idea of, at some points during this book, she realizes that she is responsible for her ancestors' livelihood. And do they need to exist so that she can exist? But then she already existed. So is it inevitable that she had to go back to make sure her ancestors can survive? And again, time travel, the concept of time travel is really a topic you can get lost in. So that was very interesting to think about how time travel works in relation to this book. I gave this book a 4 out of 5, so obviously there were some things I didn't enjoy about this book. For me, I didn't enjoy this book because it was so grim. Like, there really, truly, no characters really change for the better in this book. You hope they do, but they really don't, and it's just such a dark book. So that was kind of like a negative for me because it just made me feel blah. But it didn't detract me from like not liking the book. It was just dark. Well, the reason why I gave this book a 4 out of 5 is because this is a sci-fi book and because there is time travel. It's never really clear explained why it happens or mechanics of time travel. And obviously, without ruining the book, there was something that happened to Dana while she's time traveling where I'm just like, like I wish the author took time to explain more of the logic of this universe. There were many things I enjoyed about the book, despite being a very heavy subject. I think this book provokes a lot of discussion for anyone that reads this book with their friends and family. Even though slavery is abolished and it's such an old and outdated thing, there are still things that bleed into society today. I mean, that's why there's Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. I really enjoyed the interpersonal relationship with I also really enjoyed the interpersonal relationships that Dana had with all of the slaves in the cookhouse, and also in the way the interpersonal relationships he had with the slave master's family, with Rufus, with the mother, with the father. It's interesting to see how there was so much tension back then, and the author did a really good job just capturing it. I felt like I was on the edge of my seat the whole time reading it. And also, like, in some twisted way, this book gave me some empathy for slave masters. As I mentioned earlier, I do think people are a product of their environment, and like people back then weren't given tools to know better. And also I think this need to, like, if you grew up in the South and all your neighbors have slaves and they're economically doing well, in some ways I understand, like, you feel that's the only way you can get your family making more money. It's wrong, but I can see the logic behind it. So this book definitely made me open my perspective in ways I didn't expect it to. On Goodreads, this book got an average, a very high average of 4.3 out of 5. I think that's amazing because this book has been now out for like 30, 40 years and it still has a very high rating. Reasons why people didn't like it was similar to me. People didn't like how this is a sci-fi book. However, there wasn't really explanation of how time travel works. I think people also felt this book was classified as sci-fi, but again, I feel this book, like I said earlier, is more of like historical fiction about slavery, and they just utilize the little small snippet of time travel to bring the character back to slavery. But like, it really isn't really a sci-fi book, so I think people felt like they were bamboozled by that. People also didn't like Dana, the protagonist's motive of doing and not doing things in the book. They felt it was very unrelatable, and they thought that I guess they expected Dana to make more of a stand or fight for the rights of the slaves. But I feel that's kind of like not an accurate review because, unless you're back there experiencing it, like, it's really like you being alive or not. So it's not as easy as just taking the stand. Also, there are lots of bad reviews, but these people didn't finish the book, and I feel like these aren't valid reviews or ratings for me because I think you really have to truly finish a book in full, even if you don't like it, just to give a valid review. Reasons why people enjoyed this book on Goodreads is they thought it didn't sugarcoat the horrors of slavery. They like how Dana went back and forth between her present day and back to where her ancestors lived during the 1800s. And one review I actually want to quote is, the novel is a potent metaphor for modern African American experience and the American experience in general. We may be low into the feeling that we may have advanced, that we've made progress as a society, but at any moment we may be yanked back into the past and reminded where we came from. So I think this is a very great review. It really summarizes how powerful and strong intergenerational trauma can be and has a lasting impact on people who are descendants of the slave trade. Why I think you should read this book. I think you should read it if you want to open your mind or not have any exposure like me to slavery in the 1800s in the US. I also think you should read this book if you love watching books that get adapted later. Even though this book came out in 1979 and they have started to make a TV show about this book. However, the only difference is in the book, the present day is 1976. In the TV show, the present day is 2016. So I think that will be very interesting to see it skew to more of a modern time. Now I'll share how this book made me feel, because if people recommend me a book, I'll always ask how the book made them feel. Because if you ask me a week, a year, 5 years from now, I probably won't remember exactly what the book was about, but I'll always remember how it made me feel. So this book, Kindred by Octavia Butler, it made me feel very heavy. Even though people always say it was so long ago, things are different now, it's still something that happened, in reality, and humans experienced it. Maybe not you and me specifically, but as a collective, like, yo, we did that. So this book made me feel really heavy, and it was an important read. Thank you for watching until the end of my book review for Kindred by Octavia Butler. My next book is a book that's actually written by a fellow booktuber, Just the Book Freak. It is called Lakeside Cemetery. If you want to show her support, I will also link her book down below, and you can buy a physical copy or a ebook version. I think I got my ebook version for like literally a few bucks. So I think it's great if you want to show her some support. And again, thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.